Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Living in the Light. Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramahansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dearest friend Swami Kriyananda, help us to attune ourselves deeply with your inner presence. We long to be with you. We long to feel your presence at all times. We are your children. Take us by the hand. Guide us home. Om. Peace. Amen. All right, friends. We are going to continue now. Yesterday I commented without reading, so today I'll continue. So Swamiji has just made a case. We're getting toward the end of this brochure. Everything ends, no matter how long I string it out. It always eventually comes to an end. So Swami has been talking here. This section is called A New Movement. The time has come to start a movement among spiritual seekers of this age. Not all will feel inspired to follow this way in an institutional sense. But what of it? Yogananda stressed the inwardness and the non-dogmatic nature of his mission. Now, even though all of this is timeless in its implication, this also, the timing of this, which was 1983, is also relevant. This was actually before there was any litigation over Master's legacy as to whether someone could have a monopoly on it. This was a time when Swamiji was just trying to begin to explore what really might be possible in a bigger sense. And there was also something else going on, which over and over again through the years, Swamiji was constantly trying to create a flow of energy around Master's ray that was emanating from Ananda, related to Ananda, but not defined by Ananda. He was always trying to articulate it in such a way that it would get bigger. I don't want to say this was in reaction to what Self-Realization Fellowship was doing, but he would observe what SRF was doing and comment on it and use it as a salutary example for the ways in which religious movements can be developed. And unfortunately, much of the time, it was an example of what he would prefer to see not happen. And in 1983, and to an extent still today, which is a whole different discussion, because SRF was founded by Master, and I know I talked about this in one of these series here, one of the sections of this series, because it is well established and appears to be financially well off, the human mind naturally thinks that physical stature, physical properties and so on indicate spiritual stature. It can, but it doesn't necessarily do that. And especially in 1983, when Ananda was embryonic in certain ways, it was hard to see them as a parity, as equal spiritually. And it wasn't a competition. It wasn't that Swami was trying to compete. It was that Swami was trying to establish principles. And much of what a person of great spiritual realization and vision is doing is laying groundwork. Because Master, in his own life, for example, he started many things that never really came to fruition in his lifetime, but he was indicating possible directions. Even when Swami started writing music, he realized that Master himself had written music, had written songs, and had taken existing melodies and changed them into spiritual songs. And so Master was laying out the possibilities of what a person could do if you're following this path. And it doesn't mean, and this is an important point, that you can only do the things he did, but the things he did give you a feeling of the vibration. And I've also talked about that both in this series and in others, about what the blueprint really is. The blueprint is a vibration of energy. But Swami was very attentive to that. But he was always looking for a way to try to establish a Dwapara Yuga understanding rather than simply replicating the Kali Yuga image that we'd seen. Institutional religion, I mean, the Catholic Church is the apex of institutional religion. And many times, Swamiji found when he was still living in SRF that they were looking to see what the Catholics had done as a way to understand what they might do. Where Swami's point of view was to look and see what the Catholics had done was an absolute definition of what he didn't want to do. I'm going to tell you this story. I don't know if Swami ever published this anywhere or not, but he told this to us. When SRF, after Master died, was going to start having retreats, and they wanted to think about how they might do them, they wanted to see how the Catholics were doing retreats. So Swami was to go out and attend a Catholic retreat and then come back and tell them about it. So he said he wasn't able to find a retreat on short notice that was in English, so he actually went to one that was in Spanish, which was the language he spoke. So he went to the Spanish language retreat, and the priest, he said, was just about as narrow and institutional and fanatical in his approach to Christianity, to the point where Swami found it offensive. And now, Swami doesn't usually do things like this, but he must have been sorely provoked, and he must have felt Master's blessing on doing it. So when it came time to have questions, there was a question and answer section where they were all supposed to submit questions. Swami wrote a number of different questions on different pieces of paper with different handwriting and with different pens. And it was all metaphysical, esoteric kinds of questions that made the priest feel that his congregation was a hotbed of heretical thinking. When he told the story, he did not seem at all repentant or sorry about what he'd done. However that priest had come across, Swami felt he deserved it. So if anybody knows that Swami published that somewhere, tell me, because I really don't know, but it's such a marvelous story. He said he just had it with that man. He couldn't let it stand. Okay. When Swami would tell the story, he would laugh too about how much he enjoyed, by making up all the questions and making them all look like they were from different people. And so now moving right along. So let me even try to think where I was when I was trying to talk about this. Oh yes, I was trying to say, so there's a subplot going on in this. What I was trying to say is countless times Swami tried to separate the ray of Master's grace from all institutions. He had lots of different ways that he tried to do that. Swami also has a characteristic about him, which I think he described it partly as Turian, but I'm not really sure of that, where he said he would always try everything that doesn't work first before he would go to the solution that he knew would work. He had to make sure that all other options were pushed aside. So his constant inclination to sort of try things, like, for example, when he wrote the Oratorio, which was a couple of years later than this, I think. Let's see, when was the Oratorio written? 83, 84. It was around the same period of time, actually, in the early 80s. And the Oratorio, after he took a pilgrimage with Rosanna to Israel, and then he wrote The Life of Christ in Music. Then he became quite determined. He was going to start this movement of intercommunion based on the group, the charismatic Catholic group, of which Rosanna was a leader in Italy, and in Europe he was hoping to start a movement of intercommunion, which was to infiltrate into the Catholic Church through that group, and then to all Christian churches, an idea of a deeper experience of Christ. An inner communion he thought was the perfect segue, because they were already familiar with the concept of communion. If you presented even the word meditation or Kriya yoga, these were clearly foreign concepts that would not be wanted, but communion was already there, so you're just moving it an inch farther. And so he organized, he sponsored within Ananda. We had something called JAPA, the Joyful Arts Production Association, and under the auspices of that Ananda department, the Oratorio, which at that time was, excuse me, just give me a moment. The Oratorio at that time could be presented without live singers. There was a recorded soundtrack with narration that was coordinated with slides of the Holy Land in this dissolve unit system. This was all, bear in mind, in the 80s, before what's possible is possible now. So one person could carry this presentation around. So over the course of a couple of years, I mean, we did at least 100 performances of that in churches all over the country, Christian churches. But the association with the Italian group fell apart. The work in America never really took hold. And finally, Swami sort of shrugged his shoulders and said, you know, our audience is not the people in the churches. He said, it's the people who have either left the churches or never entered. That's how he put it. But he also said, I knew it wouldn't work. That was sort of the first time I heard him say something like this. He said, I knew it wouldn't work, but I felt I owed it to them to try. That was how he said. And then you have to understand Swami's sense of humor. And then he laughed and he said, and they have all that wonderful real estate. Like it would be so efficient if we could just like move into what they have instead of having to create all of it ourselves. He was always humorous in the way he would describe things. It was a serious comment, but that I knew it wouldn't work, but I owed it to them to try. It's just, you don't know what kind of relationship Swami is talking about, but this is how he put it. So he was always trying to free Master's teaching of institutional imprint, including the Ananda imprint. He always saw Ananda as the launching pad, but not the definition of. Later in the late 90s, when he moved from Ananda Village to Ananda Sisi, and in Ananda Sisi, he had no organizational responsibilities, unlike the village, since he had founded the village himself personally. He had no organizational responsibilities, and the home he got was several kilometers from the center and was completely isolated, because he said at that time he needed to separate himself even from Ananda so that he could really feel where Master wanted him to go. He didn't want to be, he didn't want his future to be defined by his past. He said Ananda was important, but not the definition of Master's mission. It's just his mind was always so much bigger than ours. So that's what he's trying to establish with this. He's trying to establish a direct relationship between any individual who's inspired by Master and Master himself. He's trying 100% to do the opposite of institutional religion. As I've several times defined it, institutional religion is when the institution itself makes itself a necessary link between the devotee and God, or between the disciple and guru. That's the definition of it. It's not satsang, it's not communities, it's not the Festival of Light or Kriya preparation classes. I mean, all of that is just what you do to help people. That doesn't make you institutional. It's making yourself essential to the relationship. So he has always wanted to make it clear that there's only the devotee, God and Guru, and everything else supports that relationship, but can never define or dictate it. So after saying all of that, so he's saying the rest of it is dye them in the wool of their own divine experience through Kriya Yoga, Master would often say. Through too much dogmatism, divine truth in the West has become suffocated. This is no longer the age of institutionalism, but of individual inner commitment of self-realization. This is I read that part a day or two ago. So now Swami says, and now he's speaking to those who have been trained in Master's teaching through a more institutional approach, either because specifically they've been trained by SRF with its more institutional way of thinking, or like many Westerners, we're just subconsciously strongly influenced by Kali Yuga ways of doing things, by old incarnations in Christian monasteries, and we don't even realize it, but we're insecure, or we're just habituated to thinking those ways are right. So now Swami says, do any of my statements seem erroneous? And would you like to challenge it? Then please do one thing. Don't ask yourself what should work. And don't go on from there to tell yourself it must work, so therefore it does. Rather, look about you and see what is working. Base your understanding on what you actually see. This is Swamiji's often repeated suggestions for how to think clearly. This is his personal confession of how he was who he was. I mean, so often our reason follows feeling. We want it to be a certain way. And so we don't really look clearly and honestly at actual experience. We just take our ideas and try to insist that our idea must be true. Whereas Swamiji is constantly talking about, let's look at what is. I remember in a satsang in the early 70s when one of the young people in our community asked Swami, what did he think of the sexual revolution? Because in the 60s, that's what the words were. This just sort of breaking down of traditional morality that just gradually completely blew our society in a new direction. Swami said he was a representative of a very orthodox teaching and himself a monk. And he said, overall, I think it's a good idea, which of course was not at all the answer that was expected, because, he said, people are making experience the criteria of their values. And then, of course, he put the caveat in, which only some people heard, it's a good thing provided people are honest about their experience. Because what is considered to be traditional moral values are not actually imposed from the outside. They are genuinely discovered from the inside. That certain actions have certain consequences, and suffering is caused by certain actions, and happiness is brought by other actions. And when experience becomes the criteria for our values and our behavior, then no one can take that away from us. No one can talk you out of it, because we know from the inside out. And of course, that kind of social moray is quite incidental compared to a real understanding of what is spiritually true. So that's what Swami is saying about this, this question about where our inspiration comes from, and the right that we have to define our own relationship with God, and not to allow any institution or external authority to do that for us, provided we are honest about our experience and we are humble in our receptivity. Because, of course, part of this is, he's said repeatedly, those who try to tune in to those who have more experience than them do better spiritually. So everything he's saying is really very balanced if you take it as a whole, because some people will read something like this and declare themselves independent of all input. And Swami starts this whole thing by saying, I've never seen that work. So that's what he's talking about. But he does say, look at what is working. Base your understanding on what you actually see. And what should you look for? Those who live in tune with the divine ray will manifest in their lives increased love, harmony, and joy. More especially, they will radiate those particular qualities which belong to that ray. But those who work against the ray will manifest in their lives a growing disharmony and a diminution of love. It's very interesting because in the early years of Ananda, we had a lot of neighbors who were very much into the marijuana world. I think we still do at Ananda Village, but I'm not there anymore, so I can't say. And many of them were extremely nice people with overall values that I endorsed more than other kinds of values. But the effect of constant intoxication was they manifested the marijuana ray. And the marijuana ray was, I can only say, not as radiant as the meditation ray. It was just a very different kind of energy. Nice people. You had nothing against them. Many of them were nice. Some of them, over time, as more money got involved, were thugs. But at the time that I was involved in it, many were nice people. But they didn't radiate. There was actually a very interesting quality. I'm just going to put it out for contrast. There was a time, several times, 1976 and 1981 especially, I was quite involved with the neighborhood because we were doing these political movements. They were very physically identified. I always had the feeling that the people I were talking to were much older than I was. And only gradually did I realize that they weren't, that we were actually pretty much the same age. But they lived in the physical world much more profoundly than I did. And I presumed intoxication would do that because you're actually changing your body chemistry. You're separating yourself from your rational mind to a certain extent. You're separating yourself from common perception. But I will have to speak because I do have personal experience. It's more like a sideways movement. Strong psychedelics are slightly different, but still, it's still a chemical change. It's not an actual change of consciousness. And my observation, and this is not very scientific, is that it made you more physically identified. And therefore, your physical age was a much deeper part of who you were than it was for Ananda, because we were constantly separating ourselves from our physical body in an expanded way. Anyway, that's just a thought. But what Swami's talking about, and I use that as an extreme example, is that you begin to radiate what you are in tune with. And he even puts the warning out there if you work against the ray, because there was opposition against many things that Swami said. That's why he said that. Am I wrong? So if you work against it, you also begin to manifest the opposite qualities. You may begin to manifest. So now we get to the last part of this brochure, which Swami calls an invitation. Would you like to join this divine family of self-realization? If so, how can you do so? There are several ways, and in any case, your first step should be to do so in your own heart. I want to put out another thought briefly here. Many of the initiatives that Swami started never took hold, but it wasn't for lack of validity or even lack of commitment on the part of Swamiji. It was merely that he was going to map a trail rather than actually walk to the end of it. And one of the reasons I've pulled up this brochure to talk about it is he talks about something here that may become possible within the span of lifetime of some of the people who are hearing this. Not likely within my lifetime, but easily within the lifetime of many of you. As Dwapara Yuga increases, as perhaps the challenge of living in this world increases and people are more dynamically driven to seek a spiritual life, we want to make our front door as wide as we can make it. So Swami says here, do you want to join this family of self-realization? We want to meditate very deeply on the possibilities that Swamiji held out for serving the Master's ray. And many of us are deeply committed to building Ananda as such, but Ananda is Master's spiritual family first, and a manifestation of this ray first, and the specifics of it are in service to that, it itself does not define it. So keeping a broad view. There are several ways, Swami says, that you can join this spiritual family. Your first step should be to do so in your own heart. There was a woman who came to me once, gradually over time, and I'll comment about this in a moment. We've sort of developed a system for helping people to understand what they're getting into when they want to become disciples of Master. And I remember a woman came to me, and she was brand new, and she deeply and sincerely wanted to be initiated as a disciple. To my everlasting regret, I didn't just initiate her on the spot, which it was a good lesson for me because I really should have done that. Instead, I guess the word is insisted. I guided her toward our several months long course and sort of understanding more about this path and more about what discipleship is. And I before I finish this course, this series of conversations, I'm going to go back to that, but I'm not going to say it now. But she was genuinely a disciple, and she was deeply hurt because I didn't recognize that. And later I realized I should have recognized it. It was there right in front of me. And I myself allowed myself to get caught in my own systems. And I want to talk about more. There's more to say about that. But your first step should be to do so in your own heart. It is possible first to limit your joining to a purely inward commitment. Swami recognizes that. But I've already mentioned that those who seek attunement on their own receive less usually than those who affiliate with others on the path, particularly with those more advanced. I've stressed also the importance of serving the ray, a thing more difficult, though still possible, to do on one's own. Why not, then, stress for everyone the importance of outward affiliation? The reason, Swamiji writes, is that people are constituted differently. Much is lost in religion when everyone is pushed and squeezed into the same mold, which brings me back to what I was saying. I think that we're calling this segment True Teaching as Individual or something like that. And that was a whole chapter that Swami wrote in The Path, True Teaching as Individual. The convenience of an institutional religion, as Swami says, is it provides clarity and coherence. And as I have commented on, it's sometimes, which is often clarity and coherence and unequivocal, this is the way it is often essential for some people to be able even to perceive the spiritual path, and then they can grow from that into something more subtle. But by the time we're standing on self-realization, no one is standing on the path of self-realization unless some of that subtlety is already there. I've been so amused over the years. Some people would come into our church and they just would love it. They would just feel the energy. They would love the music. They would just like everything about it. And other people have walked into our church, sat through a service, walked out, and never come back. Because as far as they can see, nothing is happening. Everybody's sitting silent with their eyes closed. It's just like nothing is happening. And the music is too unrajasic, too sattvic, just everything about it. It's like they don't even know what's going on there. In the Bhagavad Gita, it talks about that. It talks about the various stages of sort of how you have to go through the spiritual path. But self-realization is you and God. So, of course, there are metaphysical truths that everyone shares, but true teaching has to be individual. Master went so far as to say that you only have to do 1% of what he taught. But everybody takes a different 1%. That's why he had to teach so much. So that's why Swami called his seminal book the Art and Science of Raja Yoga, because there's a science which is true for everyone, and then there's the art of how you apply it. So, my friends, we'll continue on this tomorrow. God bless you.